Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. From wherever you are in the world, thank you for tuning in to our session on graph connectors and Project Cortex. My name is James Lau, and I lead the product team for graph connectors. I'm thrilled to be co-presenting with Naomi Moneypenny today. Hey, Naomi, do you want to say hi to the audience?
I'd love to. Thanks so much, James. It's such a privilege to be with you all today. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name's Naomi Moneypenny, and I lead the product development for Project Cortex. Over to you, James.
Thanks, Naomi. Here is what we're going to be covering today. I will start by providing you with an overview of what graph connectors are, telling you a little bit about the motivation behind building one and how to get started. Then we'll jump into a demo to see how graph connectors and Project Cortex can work together. Then Naomi will tell you about more ways that you can use to extend the Project Cortex experience. Then we'll wrap up with some Q&A. With that, let's get started. So I'd like to start off by showing you a picture. Of course, you'll recognize that this is a picture of a brain, but it's not just any brain. It's a very smart brain because you can see that it's all lit up. The human brain is composed of billions of neurons to store and process data. But human intelligence doesn't depend on neurons alone. The interconnectivity between these neurons is absolutely critical to human intelligence. Now, you think about organizational intelligence, it's very similar. The modern organization has tons and tons of data, whether it's in HR systems, training, file collections on-prem, in the cloud, sales data. All this data, if they're living in silos, users in your organization will not be able to discover them, let alone analyze or act upon them. So organizational intelligence is critically dependent on connected data. And this is where graph connectors can help. Microsoft Graph Connectors allow you to bring in third-party or external content into the Microsoft Graph, which in turn power a number of intelligent experiences. The most critical one is probably search. By bringing in external data through Graph Connectors into Microsoft Search, you can make your data easily searchable through Microsoft Search and all the endpoints that it powers. Now, last year at Ignite, we announced a preview of Graph Connectors powering search experiences. And we're happy to announce today that we're expanding the preview program to all customers in targeted release over the next several weeks. We will also be adding new connectors and new features into the preview over the next couple of months. We are targeting to reach general availability this year. Next is Project Cortex. By bringing in your external data, they can participate in the AI generation of topic cards and topic pages, giving users in your organization a more holistic view of what's going on in your organization. Throughout Microsoft 365, there are various intelligent discovery experiences like Delve, but they also exist in Office client apps, Office.com, Edge, and more. Again, by bringing in your external data through Graph Connectors, the data will be able to participate in these wonderful experiences. The key thing to know here is that by building a Graph Connector and bringing in external data today, you can have search lit up immediately, but the value of your connector will accrue more and more over time as more of these experiences light up in the future. Now, let me shift gear a bit and talk a little bit about how you go about building a graph connector. A connector at a high level is simply an application that performs a one-way synchronization of content and ACLs from the data source into the Microsoft Graph. You will need to build two high-level components. The first one is the administrative component, where you will need to store information about the data source so you know how to read it. You will need to manage the access token to the graph so that you can call the APIs. You will need to gather some schema information, and depending on your data, this could be a fixed schema that you know about, or something more flexible that you will require input from the administrator. Then you will need to create connection on the Graph API and create a schema on top of that connection. The second component is the sync component. Here is where you will need to traverse the data source to read it, to ingest it into the graph. You will need to implement your sync strategy, and that depends on your data source. This could be something simplistic, like a periodic full sync, or it could be more advanced, like an incremental delta sync, or maybe you get real-time notification of data changes. Third, you will need to ensure the ACLs are correct so that the data that you ingest is only visible to the users who are meant to see them. Finally, you will make the call to create, update, or delete item in the graph. Now I will walk you through the 3 API calls that are critical to building your own connector. The first call is simply the create connection call. Here I have highlighted the endpoint so you know where to find it. You simply pass it a connection ID, name, and description. The connection ID is something that we will reuse in later calls. And the name and description is something that will show up in the administrative UI. Next, we'll create a schema for that connection. Notice here on the endpoint, Contoso tickets is the connection ID that I previously passed in. And in the body of the create schema call, I defined a schema, which is a list of properties. Each property, you define the name of the property, the data type, and an optional set of behaviors, whether the property should be searchable, retrievable, refinable, queryable, so on. If you're not familiar with these behaviors, you can learn more about them in our documentation. Finally, I want to draw your attention to a new feature we call semantic labels, which allows you to specify a collection of well-known strings to tell the Microsoft Graph what this particular property semantically mean. So in this particular example, the property name is ticket title, but you're also saying that semantically, it's just a title. There are other well-known strings that you can use to tell Microsoft Graph what your property semantically mean. And we will add more in the future to support future scenarios. Now that we have the connection and schema done, it's time to create an external item. And you do that by calling put on this particular endpoint. You can use any ID that you'd like, and this often can come from the data source itself. And in the body of this request, there are 3 sections. The first section is the ACL section, where you specify the access control list of who should have access to this item. Next, you supply the property values, which should adhere to the schema that you previously defined. And finally, in the content part, you specify the body of your item in either text or HTML format. Anything you put in here will automatically be added to the full text index. Now let's jump into a demo to see how Project Cortex and Graph connectors can work together.
So let's take a look at the Microsoft Search connector in action. If I go over to my search page here on my intranet, I can click in and look at something around Mark 8, which is a specific project in my company. Now, in addition to the normal search results, I also see this very rich topic card here that helps me to understand a little bit about the people and the resources. Now, you may have noticed already that some of these resources are coming directly from MediaWiki, and that's because they're basically brought in by that Microsoft Search connector, and I can go off and actually explore that differently here as well if I wanted to go directly to those results. Now, the cool thing is I can take this information and use it in lots of different ways once it's part of the Microsoft Graph. And that's really where Project Cortex comes in. So for example, if I was here and I'm just reading a news page on my intranet, maybe I'm not familiar with what the Mark 8 program is. You can see that a highlight has been automatically applied here. And when I hover over that highlight, I get that information directly in here. So it helps me to understand a little bit about the project and the people and the resources that are connected. Now, what Project Cortex is doing is mining through all of the content that you have in Microsoft 365, in addition to the content that you've connected through the Microsoft Graph, and automatically surfacing up topics and projects within your organization. Now, if I want to go off and check out this particular resource here, so I can see, for example, the Mark 8 page that came from MediaWiki, you can see here's my pretty standard MediaWiki page. I can check through that information, and I can just consume that directly in here too. Now, if I want to go through and have a look at the topic page itself, this has been generated again by AI within Project Cortex. It helps you to understand a little bit about that specific project, and it mines through understanding the information that you have inside of your company and keeping it up to date. Now, the great thing is that once AI has taken kind of that first cut of the page, you can then come in as a subject matter expert and curate the information that's important to you, whether those are people or resources that you think people should be able to have access to. And then you can also see that AI is doing that hard work of keeping the page up to date by discovering new resources and putting that through here as well. In addition, I can use it for topic visualization, and it helps me to understand how things are connected to inside of my organization, so I can explore new topics within my company. Great. So if you're not familiar with Project Cortex, let me tell you a little bit about what's included. First off, it's really 3 interlocking capabilities. We're looking at how you can discover knowledge from topics inside of your organization automatically. So we're going to look through all of the content that you have in Microsoft 365 and all of that great Microsoft Graph connected data and figure out what topics are relevant inside of your organization. We also have some new great capabilities around how we organize content. So thinking about the managed metadata services, content types, and structured information architecture as a really great complement to AI inside of your organization. And then finally, we have a big area around content understanding, how we can help to understand the information that you have coming inside of your organization. Think about all the business process information that's coming in every day. How can we help you to make meaning of that and extract the metadata that you need as part of this? Of course, all of Project Cortex is based on top of the Microsoft Graph and all of the great capabilities that we have inside of AI and the content services portfolio overall. And I'm pleased to announce today that Project Cortex will be available at general availability in early summer of this year. So just a couple months to wait. So let's talk a little bit about some of the capabilities and how you can use this from an extension perspective. First off, you heard James talk a little bit about what we can do in terms of the content connectors. And with those rich set of content connectors, you'll be able to bring in information from outside of Microsoft 365 and have those be available to all of the great capabilities we have with Project Cortex. Now, really where I'd like to focus this particular piece of the presentation on is how we think about topics and metadata and kind of structured content inside of your organization. Now, we have a couple different ways to help you understand the APIs that we're going to have available as part of Project Cortex in here as well. And so this is one of those areas where you get the best of both worlds, both what we are helping you to discover automatically from the content you already have, which is really around the topics API set. And then we have a whole bunch of information that we have around metadata and the structured capabilities that come through the term store as well as content types. Now, of course, all of this great capability doesn't live in isolation. There's a rich landscape using Azure and Power Platform, and you can use a lot of those existing capabilities that are out there to help you understand a little bit more about what you'd like to do with your specific line of business application. So let's dive a little bit deeper into what we can do in terms of the capabilities we have. So when we look at topics, we'll have a set of Microsoft Graph enabled APIs to help you discover topics inside of your organizations. And we'll look at the different kinds of entities, their relationships, and how they're structured. Those will be coming off later. What's coming the fastest and quickest, which is what everybody's always interested about, is really the idea around structured data inside of your organization. We'll have a brand new set of APIs that are available as part of the term store and looking at how you can manage metadata inside of your organization. In addition to this, we'll have a rich set of capabilities around content types and being able to understand the different ways that you can use those inside of your organization. And of course, available now, as you're hearing throughout the whole of Build, is understanding a little bit about Azure, the great capabilities in cognitive services and in computer vision, and then thinking about how you can use the Power Platform and things like Power Automate to help you drive new scenarios as well. So let's get one step deeper and talk about a little bit in terms of the structured APIs that we'll have available for metadata in particular. So when you think about the benefits of using a taxonomy inside of your organization, you may or may not be familiar with a service called the Managed Metadata Service that we've had inside of Microsoft 365 for quite some time. But we've done a huge amount of improvement, not just on the modern UI experiences, but also a whole new set of graph APIs that will be available at GA. When you look at taxonomy, it's a really important way to think about how we structure information together and think about the relationships between that information. It helps you to bring consistency in navigation and in search and in finding and discoverability inside of your organization. And so we wanted a brand new set of APIs that help you with this. Now, for example, in this case, my term store is made up of multiple term sets, and you'll have different ways to access this information as we put here. Now, let's go one more step deeper and think about taxonomy itself. Now, within that taxonomy, we have a term store. We have multiple term sets, which have term groups inside of them. So you can think about it like if I had a taxonomy of programming languages or development languages, I could use within there specific groups, for example, C-based languages or Ruby-based languages. And then I could use within that even more detail depending on the kind of flavor of language that I have. And this is a kind of a great way to think about how I bring all of this information together and then how I can use this in multiple different ways across those relationships as well. So one of those ideas here is you can use, of course, metadata services for different languages, for synonyms, and there's a great way to manage terms across all of these. When I look at the term sets themselves, you can see specifically for a specific language, you'll be able to specify the synonym. You'll also get those machine translation capabilities that we have as part of the managed metadata service as well. And then you can even look at things like the term relationships as well. So this is a place where maybe you've already structured a taxonomy and you want to be able to reuse those terms in other places in your applications. Maybe you want to apply that whole term set to a specific group, or I want to just reuse that term in a different way. You'll have great capabilities to help with that as well. So that's really, a really holistic picture of what we're doing with all of the managed metadata services. Let's move on to talk a little bit about content types. Now, content types are a really great way to think about information that you have inside of your organization that needs to have metadata and a template associated with it. And so we're unveiling today a really rich set of capabilities, again, for you to manage all of these things programmatically. The cool thing here is that if I have, for example, policies inside of my organization, I want to be able to apply different kinds of metadata. I want to be able to understand the attachment to other things. I maybe want to have a template for this. Maybe I have relationships between these two different types of policies. Maybe there's a child relationship in there as well. And so the content type APIs that we're delivering today are really helping to bring all of that together. They allow you to publish and to remove those content types from specific sites and to be able to use all of the different commands that we would have on the UI, but instead be able to do all of that through programmatic ways as well. Now, we think this is a great set of opportunities to really build the kinds of applications that you want to on top of Project Cortex, to use the existing capabilities you might have already been accessing as part of Microsoft 365 and all of the great work we do in the SharePoint patterns and practices area. So that's it in terms of what we wanted to cover. And now we're open for your questions, and we'd love to hear more about what you're thinking. Over to you, Eric.
Hi, all. We've gotten a good group of questions from you guys. The first question is for James. Someone wanted to know, what's your plan to have a place of consolidated search results? Currently, it's only possible in Bing integrated search. This is from Juan D.
Hi, thanks for the question. If I understand correctly, your question is, how do Graph Connector search results show up along with native results? Is that correct? I think that's probably some clarification. Today in the preview, search results show up in their own particular vertical. There's a one-to-one mapping between a vertical and a connection. We're actively working on making the search results available under the All tab, and we expect that to be available before GA.
Great. And then the next question is from Chris B. He's wanting to understand, if I have an enterprise data source, can you speak to why I duplicate data in the graph with Cortex versus creating a connector for something like Power Apps?
Yeah, so you are actually using those Microsoft Search connectors. That's the whole point. That's why James and I are presenting today. So we want to think about the ways that we're able to bring in that information. So for example, with Power Apps, you're obviously connecting off to different data sources. So whether they're within the Power Platform or in other places. And so the idea of using that same connection through the Microsoft Graph connector is the way to do it. Now with Power Automate, of course, you have the whole range of Power Platforms connectors as well. And so there are different ways to bring that information in. Once it's within the Microsoft Graph, then we get to apply all of the great capabilities that we have on top of Project Cortex.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Rick H. He says, you mentioned connectors. Will other MS services like Dynamics 365 and Azure DevOps be supported by that connector ecosystem early on?
We actually have an Azure DevOps connector that we are about to bring into preview. Dynamics is something that we're also working on, but it will be longer term.
Great. And then another question for Naomi from Sriram. How is Cortex different from Azure Cognitive Service? Or Cognitive Search, excuse me.
Sure, no worries. Yeah, it's a great question. So what we're doing with Project Cortex is really within the basis of Microsoft 365. And so our goal is to bring the best of Microsoft technologies into Microsoft 365 so that your end users get to use them directly. Now you can use the great capabilities we have in Azure Cognitive Search to basically build your own applications and do a whole bunch of developer platform areas around it. But we really want to think about how we're bringing this directly into the flow of work. And so in this case with Project Cortex, we're using capabilities not just within Azure, we're using across the Power Platform and even some really cool tech from Microsoft Research that isn't available anywhere else. And we're bringing that into the end user experience. So within Office, within Outlook, within Teams, within SharePoint, all of those applications you use every day so that you can find the knowledge you need and be able to extract the metadata you need from the business processes that you have.
Great. And then Paul S. asks, will you add support for the item body containing Markdown?
Good question.
Is that a question for,
I believe,
JPI?
That's all the detail that we have from Paul. I think this is probably a question for you, James, but
yeah, in the item body, I think he's referring to the content part of the item body in the create external item call. Right now, we only support text and HTML, but we welcome your feedback and we're happy to respond to those feedback if there is a strong need for it.
Great. And then the next question is for Naomi. This is from Drew S. and really is about the timing of the release. So wondering when Project Cortex GAs and also when it might become available for GCC tenants.
Great question. Thank you, Drew. So yeah, with general availability, we're saying early summer. So that's as much area as we want to give right now. So that's early summer is coming right up. So definitely even within the Pacific Northwest, even summer is arriving here. So that's when Project Cortex will be generally available. And then GCC is something we're looking at, of course. It goes through a whole set of audit cycles, for example, and then we have to hit the right wave of those audit cycles in order to be incorporated as part of GCC. So it'll be a ways off, but we are looking at it for sure.
Great. And then Adamos asks, will there be a connector for MongoDB?
There is not one that we planned internally, but you are always welcome to build it with our open APIs and using one of our examples as a starting point.
Great. And then for Naomi, Justin is asking, is there an easy way to take an old SharePoint 2013 term store and move it to the cloud and use it for Cortex?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, migration is one of those tools. So looking at how you think about migrating, so we can go from SharePoint 2013 into 2016 and then on into the cloud. So I know that both we have a SharePoint migration tool ourselves, as well as many of our great partners that are out there. And that's a great way to be able to go through and basically bring it into the term store that we have in SharePoint Online. There is also a new import and export capability, but import is the most relevant here as part of the managed metadata services that we have in SharePoint Online. So we are rolling those new MMS experiences out right now into SPO. You should see them just in a couple weeks if you haven't seen them already. And so you'll be able to play around with some of that functionality too, and then check out the migration tools for helping out with the migration of that information from 2013. Thanks, Justin.
And then a quick point of clarification from Andy around the term store. Mm-hmm. He's wondering, is there a connection between the enterprise term store within SharePoint and the term store within Microsoft Graph?
Yeah, so they should be one and the same, assuming we're talking about the same term store. So what we're doing with the SharePoint managed metadata services has always been the basis basically of managed metadata for the whole of Microsoft 365. We are taking that information and it's part of the graph as well. So the mind topics that we have inside of Cortex, the things we've helped to discover, then we're putting together all of this managed metadata in a very rich fashion and then making connections across all of that. That's what wonderful, beautiful thing about the Microsoft Graph is connecting all of these nodes together that previously were not connected.
And then I guess this is really a question for either one of you, but how do we ensure that information is protected? Do we anonymize data when it contains sensitive data, for example? This is from Mahan T that's asking.
So I can answer that question. Thank you for that question. From a graph connector's perspective, when you bring in external data, you are able to specify the access control list on a per item basis to ensure that the item that you put into the graph is only always accessed by the people who are supposed to have access to. Across all the different M365 experiences, whether it's Search, Project Cortex, or anywhere else. So the accoling capability is how you ensure the security is honored.
Yeah, and then of course, as part of Project Cortex, we use all of that same permissioning. So the rich set of capabilities, again, you see with microsearch, all of the permissions are obeyed. We don't change anything there to do that automatic discovery of topics. And so we're using the set of permissions you already have. If you've already used Microsoft Information Protection as well and doing things like encryption, all of that is obeyed as well as part of this.
Great. And Xiaoli asks, are connectors going to be available for searching data in Microsoft Teams?
Yes, that is something that we're actively working on. So Microsoft Search powers many of the endpoints for search experiences, whether it's within Outlook, on Microsoft Search, Office.com, Microsoft Search in Bing or SharePoint. And behind the scenes, it's also powering a lot of the search experiences in the client apps as well. So yes, we're actively looking at how to surface up Graph Connector content within some of these client experiences as well.
And then follow-up question on Cortex from Hamad. Is there a possibility Project Cortex could be integrated with Bing Search to refine search results?
It's interesting, Hamad. So we do work, of course, with Microsoft Search in Bing, where you get the best of web and work results together. And so you will see, for example, topic answers. I showed that Mark 8 result in the demo. You'll see that same topic answer appear across all of the Microsoft 365 search experiences. And so I think, when you think about Bing Consumer and Project Cortex, that's a very interesting direction. But if it's thinking about Microsoft Search and Bing for your work results, definitely are working together.
Great. And then more of a tactical question from Vili. Would the document templates for content types be stored in the root site for a hub?
Yeah, so content type gallery, all of that same functionality exists. And then we're actually looking at how we can bring content type syndication to the specific sites or hubs that you want as well. And so we're trying to do a bit more intelligent syndication that way. So for example, they could be stored inside of the hub site and then distributed basically to all the sites that are connected there as well. So we'll have more documentation on it very soon.
Great. And then more of a general question from Ernesto. Are we going to have a governance and policy model for Project Cortex?
Great question. So again, using the capabilities that you have in Microsoft 365, if I look again at the security and compliance controls, all of the Microsoft information protection work that's going on, you may have heard more about records management, file plans, sensitivity controls, document classifiers, all of the great work inside of those areas. All of that still applies, right? So it's not like we're doing something different and separate. The wonderful thing about Project Cortex is it is truly integrated into the Microsoft Graph and Microsoft 365. So all of the existing protections and governance that you have in place. Now, one of the areas that I'm very passionate about, and I'll be writing some blogs around this, is really around how do we help to balance AI, essentially, which is doing a whole bunch of mining for you on behalf of the user and figuring out stuff that could be relevant, and then information architecture. So it's always AI and IA, right? And having a balance between these two things. And so I think of all the structured capabilities we have with taxonomy and content types and the schema of your information is still just as important in that world of AI as well. I hope that helps, Ernesto.
Great. And then, James, I think this might be a question for you from Joa. actions like who accesses data, will that be tracked anywhere in protection.office, for example?
I'm assuming this question is related to external content that gets brought in through Graph connectors. Right now, we don't yet have a public API for somebody to send us those signals in terms of activities that has gone on with the external data, but this is something that we have on the roadmap.
Great. And I think we need to close out. Thank you all for your questions. I'll turn it back over to Naomi and James.
Yeah, thanks so much, Eric. It was awesome to get all your questions. And yeah, it's such a privilege to talk with you all today.
Same here. Thank you for joining us today.